The role of mHealth, or mobile technologies for cancer control, is a very exciting and emerging area, an area of research, but also an area of implementation. And what we did in our session yesterday, which was a joint session with UICC and the National Cancer Institute in the US, was to look at mHealth from the very analytical perspective set out by the WHO in collaboration with the British Medical Journal. And this included something called the MERA checklist. And I won't go through what the checklist is, but just to say that I framed my talk on the importance of being very rigorous and critical about what we do when we are planning for and then ultimately reporting an mHealth intervention in a low and middle income country in cancer control. My colleagues and I are actually about to publish a scoping review in BMJ Innovations, which is a special issue with BMJ and WHO. The mHealth story has emerged as a very promising strategy to improve outcomes, I would say, in high-income countries. But even here, we have limited data on efficacy in terms of clinical outcomes. Even changing health behaviors is an area that hasn't been reported as well as we think. We took on this scoping review to look specifically at what is out there in the literature for breast and cervical cancer control using mHealth interventions. And we applied the MERA checklist that includes, in fact, we adapted it really with an implementation science framework to use implementation science language. And what we found was, of the couple of hundred studies out there, specifically on LMIC and just for those two cancers, only 14 studies actually met our criteria. And then we went into the checklist and looked at those in a very detailed way. Most of the studies, in fact all of them, some didn't even mention whether or not they were pilot studies, they all appear to be pilot studies. Most would not really meet the entire checklist in terms of description of the infrastructure required, of the technology platforms that are needed for somebody who's reading the report, who may be interested in adapting or just even taking on the exact same strategy in another setting. There wasn't enough information to make that really feasible or practical for whoever reads the reports. In addition, and quite surprisingly, we found very little in the way of what I would call formative research, which really is, if there's an SMS text-based messaging and that's your intervention, where is your content coming from? What are the messages going to be based on? And if they're just based on the basic information regarding breast cancer and the importance of early detection, or cervical screening, or HPV vaccination, for example, without taking into account who the end user is this message going to go out to the whole population, just the women, etc.? Whether it has been tailored for cultural appropriateness, even the acceptability in the community of having such messages is often lacking in these studies. And you add to that the issue of usability of the intervention. And surprisingly, again, that's often not mentioned in these papers. And I'm critiquing my own papers here as well. The key messages here on the mHealth story for women's cancers in low and middle income countries is that we need more data. And I would encourage people interested in mHealth or who are already conducting such studies to take a look at the MERA checklist. It was published in 2016 in BMJ. I believe there's an open access availability. I will encourage WHO to put it on its website. If it's not already there, it probably is. Because you can actually reverse engineer a better study if you look at that checklist first, particularly the pre-implementation phase and the pre-project design phase. Later today, actually, I'm chairing a special session just on mHealth for cancer control. And we're really excited about this session because we have with us two superstars from their ministries of health. One from Zambia, who many people here will know, is Dr. Sharon Kapambwe, and the other from Tanzania, Dr. Safina Yuma, each who are presenting mHealth interventions in their country that are relevant, as it happens, to women's cancers. That's not our goal, is to just highlight women's cancers, but that's where a lot of the data has come from. Dr. Yuma will describe a project called CVIA, which is Smartphone Enhanced VIA, And full disclosure, I'm actually involved in this research. Dr. Kapambwe will mention the WHO and ITU partnership with the Zambian government and funding from the African Development Bank in a project called mCervical. mCervical was a breakthrough project that came out of the WHO's Be Healthy, Be Mobile platform that thus far has included tobacco control and diabetes information for patients in a variety of countries. The mCervical project is currently being evaluated, and we really look forward to updates later today from Dr. Kapambwe. The final speaker is Mridul Chowdhury, who is the founder and CEO of mPower Social Enterprises in Bangladesh. And we invited him because he has a long sort of history of, from the beginning really, of mHealth interventions, not necessarily on cancer, but on other health conditions, including using mobile strategies for disease surveillance. He's worked closely with the government in his own country, but he's also worked with WHO and other international partners and agencies to help improve health outcomes. And he has also the technical sort of know-how that I think he'll bring to this discussion in a way that we wouldn't necessarily get from we clinicians. So I look forward to that session, and I think it'll be useful perhaps to have Mridul even be interviewed later. The issue of how people, patients, or I would say people at risk for cancer, which is pretty much everyone, are engaged early on in the process of research. This is something that's critical to all of our research, and much of this is being discussed this week at the World Cancer Congress. In the case of mHealth strategies, I think we're at risk as scientists to focus a little too much on the technology and not enough on the people that we're trying to serve, who we're trying to help. So I would encourage all of us involved in this area to really take a people-centered approach, and in particular to use the language of implementation science and qualitative research, community-engaged participatory research, which means literally engaging the people who will ultimately be benefited or not benefited by whatever the strategy is in the pre-design phase of your study, all the way through to knowledge dissemination and translation. I think that perhaps is the most important message that's often left out of such discussions. So I think another aspect of mHealth strategies for cancer control that is often not mentioned or perhaps not emphasized enough, in my view, is the user interface part. You know, we tend to think that somehow because perhaps this is a different community that doesn't have a lot of experience using mHealth tools, that the main content is really enough to make sure that your project will be successful. And we know that's not the case. In the scoping review that I mentioned earlier, none of those studies actually appear to have been scaled yet. And to learn enough from even somebody's well-conducted pilot study to take that into your own community and try it out requires a great deal more of this grunt work of learning how people do interface with the mHealth platform. Is it usable? You know, usability testing is probably the most important thing. And what do we know as oncologists about usability testing? So I think we need to learn a lot from the other industries that have perfected, to some degree, the whole world of mobile applications before we think we're going to make an impact on health just because we have an intervention. Even a point-of-care diagnostic tool might be cheap and effective in a very carefully controlled, randomized controlled trial. Carefully controlled trial. I got to say that again. Even a cost-effective point-of-care strategy for diagnosis for breast cancer, for example, if such a thing existed, the odds of it being adopted and scaled in a country to actually impact on population health will take a lot more work from the research team and from not only the usability testing, but understanding where that tool fits or doesn't fit into the health system. This is something I didn't mention probably adequately in the talk yesterday, but the strengthening of the health system through the intervention should be also our primary concern. First, whether the thing is usable or not, and second, whether it's going to actually work within a system that exists or even improve the system. So if I were to advise somebody just starting out their career in designing an mHealth intervention in cancer control, in any setting, not just a lower middle income country, I would say the following. Number one, know the context. I mean, really know it. Work with, if you're from the country that you're developing the intervention for, work with your community agencies, with your civil society organizations, your survivor advocates. At the same time, look way up to who the decision makers are and understand the health system in which you will be trialing this intervention. The second is actually to look at that WHO MERA checklist and see if you have all the elements covered, particularly before you start designing the actual intervention. And that's hard because we may have an idea and we want to run with it. But I really encourage people to take the time, look it over, and discuss it with colleagues who've actually done mHealth interventions, maybe in another domain. There's a lot we can learn from researchers who have successfully implemented, or not successfully. You can learn from the failures as well. There's a lot of rich information in maternal health, in child nutrition, in other areas besides cancer. I think that's very important. And lastly is to make sure that you engage people throughout the process who will be the end user of the product, or the patients or population who will hopefully benefit from the intervention. And then report and share your findings widely, including the challenges. I think that's the most that we can gain, is from learning what the difficulties are along the way.